This is the Logitech MX Brio. Logitech really watered down the Brio lineup over the last few years with a bunch of offerings that honestly just didn't look very good. Of all the webcams that they've released in the last 7 years, this is actually the first one that looks better than the original Brio. This webcam right here that was released in 2017. And I'll be switching back and forth between these quite a bit so that you can get a good idea of whether it's a good upgrade or not. And I'll be showing some of this webcam, the Razer Kill Pro Ultra, which came out in early 2023. So is the new Logitech MX Brio worth the $200 launch price? Let's find out. As usual, I bought this with my own money, so I'm not obligated to say anything nice about this device. Now for the specs. This webcam can record up to 4K 30 frames per second or 1080p 60 frames per second. It does have HDR. I have that turned on right now. I'll talk more about it in the image quality section, but let me just go ahead and toggle it off so that you can see the difference. This is with the HDR turned off. Now at this resolution in 4K, it records in MJPEG, but at 1080p 60 frames per second and lower, it can be set to YUY2 or NV12, which both slightly improve the image quality. By default, the MX Brio is set to a 90-degree field of view, but you can crop this in to 78 degrees or 65 degrees. You can also just zoom manually if you want to in whatever software that you're using. Now this is going to be a digital zoom, not optical, so it's going to degrade the image quality, but this still can be very useful if you have a cluttered or distracting background like what I've got behind me. So I can definitely relate. I think 78 is a pretty good medium point here. 65 might be too zoomed in on your face, but I'm going to leave it at 90 so we can get the full quality right here. The camera is 8.5 megapixels, but the more important specifications like the sensor size, focal length, and lens aperture, they're not stated at all, and there's no documentation in the box that says what they are. And I'll tell you exactly why that is later in this review, if you haven't already guessed it yourself. The MX Brio has a fantastic build. The body is metal, which gives it a premium weight and feel. There's a privacy shutter built into the webcam itself under the lens, and twisting it opens and closes it. The monitor mount connects magnetically to the webcam, which is both convenient and allows the MX Brio to be angled precisely. Overall, this is the best built webcam I've used, and it's not overly bulky. The only two things I don't really like are, number one, the adhesive on the monitor mount, which can be useful, but it's unnecessary and it will inevitably get grimy and lose its stick over time. And number two, the USB-C to C cable is only 59 inches long. That's extremely disappointing, especially if you have your PC kind of farther away from you, but this was a solved problem with the Logitech Brio from 2017. When it comes to image quality, the MX Brio does a lot of things right. At 4K 30 frames per second, the footage is pretty sharp. I do have studio lighting on right now, but I will be showing some clips where there is less lighting. Just for example, I recorded this in just daylight earlier today. And when you compare it directly to this, the original Brio, basically every aspect of the image quality has been improved in the MX Brio. There's far less grain in the MX Brio, which is especially noticeable in the Brio in darker areas. The colors are improved. You don't have quite the same kind of greenish yellow tint around everything like the Brio does. You even get tint control in G Hub to ensure this, but I'll talk about that a little bit in the software section. And the algorithm for automatic settings in daylight and even in studio lighting is a whole lot better. So if I switch over to the MX Brio right now, this is at manual. The Brio I had at manual as well. But when you set these both to full auto, the MX Brio does a whole lot better of a job at just exposing your face properly. It might underexpose the background, but if you have HDR turned on, which I do have it turned on right now, it'll brighten up some of those dark areas and everything just looks a whole lot nicer. Now I've set this to 1080p 60 frames per second and it looks excellent here as well and very fluid as it should. And while there is an overall expected decrease in the detail and clarity, it's a lot less choppy compared to 30 frames per second footage, which is especially noticeable when you have gameplay in the background if you're using this like as a face cam. So I'll talk more about the HDR in the software section, but overall, I'll go ahead and toggle this on and off again so that you can see. It basically makes it so the darker areas of the shot, this is with it on, and now this is with it off. It makes it so the darker areas don't have such an extreme amount of contrast. Also, it makes the image a lot sharper. I wouldn't say that this is just HDR, like high dynamic range. I think it's a lot of AI post-processing all together in here. And in OBS, I toggle this with the backlight compensation, but it has the exact same effect as when I actually am in G Hub and I toggle HDR on or off. And honestly, the image is kind of soft with HDR off when it's 1080p 60 frames per second like it is right now. At 4K, the sharpness loss isn't that noticeable, but this is kind of like a airbrushed kind of look. So I wouldn't really actually even recommend using this with HDR off. Usually I'm not a big fan of HDR, but the way that this is implemented seems a lot different than how other webcams are doing it. And for a quick comparison, this is the original Brio at 1080p 60 frames per second. Also got that fluidity, but this is at MJPEG 1080-60, whereas the MX Brio at 1080-60 can also do YUI Tune and V12. But with all that said, this does have some really fierce competition. This is the Razer Kill Pro Ultra. Originally launched for $300 as an exclusive from Razer's website. This is still, to me, clearly the best webcam on the market in terms of image quality. The blurry background, and this is not from some sort of post-processing, this is just from the lens and the sensor itself creating that effect. Way less grain in the image. It's a lot more cropped in. I believe it's like 80 or something degrees field of view, but there's a lot more detailed colors overall. Now, when you compare it to the MX Brio, yeah, it looks a whole lot more washed out, and it just seems like there's certain colors that are missing. Like from my face, it's all just one kind of brown. It doesn't have like the reddish and then also the darker browns all together. But with the Kill Pro Ultra, you really get more of like that vibrancy. You have all of the colors are really represented. Now I'm going to quickly go over the MX Brio software. This is Logitech G Hub. If I select this in here, you'll get a preview of the video itself. This is really good software. You can see the exposure and it has the actual exact shutter speed. So you can go 1/120 or whatever increments you want to. I'm doing 1/60 because it makes it pretty smooth when it's at 30 frames per second. I'll show that at 60 frames per second in a little bit. 400 is the ISO I have, which works well with the specific lighting I have. HDR is turned off. I'll talk about that just in a second. And then, you have the auto white balance, which it does an okay job, but as you can see, my manual settings make it a lot less yellow. It's a lot more just fine tuned. This is what I have exactly. And I really like that you can control this. The only problem is that it's a little slow. Like you have to actually click it to get exactly what you want. And then you have to let it go so that you can see what it looks like. The tint control is amazing. Now, fortunately, you don't really need this because they have the tint dialed in pretty well. But this is one thing. This is about where you would end up with the Logitech Brio, is you'd be stuck around like -3 or something like that. Obviously, it's not something that you can see, but that's the equivalent to how you would be if you were to use the automatic white balance, and you couldn't really change that at all. And these are all things that I don't really mess with personally, but you can if you want to. And of course, this does have autofocus. I leave it on because the autofocus of this device is pretty good. Take that off right here, and then you can see. Now, I do want to talk about HDR again because there is a limitation to it. So right now this is at 4K 30, and you'll see with the HDR off, here's how the movement is. A little bit of motion blur, but it's to be as expected. But if you turn the HDR on, if there's a lot of motion, it starts to have issues. So if you look at my hand really closely, you'll see that it's kind of like phasing in and out. And it's not a normal type of motion blur that if I have HDR off, you can see how it looks. So this is also noticeable at 1080p 60. But in order to do that, I'm gonna have to show it in OBS because you can't actually control the resolution over here. And now this is an OBS 1080p 60, got that soft kind of smoothed over look to it, but it is really smooth. The motion is excellent. But at 1080 60, when I turn this HDR on, it looks brighter, sharper, but you see that the motion, it's actually down to 30 frames per second, and it has that kind of like weird artifacting when there's a lot of motion going on. So that's a massive limitation. If you actually did want to use this at 1080p 60 frames per second, it's not really compatible with the HDR. Razer Kill Pro Ultra is similar. Now this is the Kill Pro Ultra at 1080p 60 frames per second. And as I'm moving here, you see you don't have any of that sort of artifacting and stuff going on. But even with HDR off, the image is still sharp, and you don't need any extra software effects to try to make the image look better. I will admit the post-processing effects of this device are actually pretty good. So when you have ultra low light, there is a ton of grain, but it's able to get the shot to be pretty usable as long as you have HDR turned on. This is HDR off, and it kind of sort of can work, but with HDR on, it's actually not a bad shot at all. And it even looks better than the automatic settings of the Razer Kill Pro Ultra. I can do a side-by-side direct comparison of these where I'm like tweaking the settings to get them perfect. Now I'm speaking directly into the MX Brio's microphones. You're not gonna ever find me actually recommending you use a webcam microphone, but this is definitely the best that I've used. So I'm gonna go ahead and do some keyboard typing and you can hear how the background noise rejection is. Now it does cut out a little bit of my PC fan, which is extremely loud. The tonality of this is good for the space that it's at and the type of microphone that it is and how small they are. So if you can avoid using this microphone, I would, but it is available. And now for my verdict. Let's keep it real. It is excellent that Logitech finally made a webcam that surpasses the Logitech Brio from 2017. Long overdue. And if you're only looking at Logitech's lineup, like all those other Brio webcams, like the Brio 505 and stuff like that, or the Brio for 2017, or even the Logitech StreamCam, which came out in 2020, which I didn't really show much comparison of because I just feel like it's overall not as good as the Brio from 2017, even though it does have better colors. Just comparing to Logitech's own lineup, it's pretty clear that this is the best webcam that they have to offer in terms of the full package. However, if you're open to looking at other brands, the rest of the field has caught up to and honestly surpassed Logitech years ago. And when you look at those, $200 really does not seem like a fair price. Sensor sizes have been getting bigger with devices like the Nexigo Iris, Elgato Facecam Pro, OBSBot Tiny 2. Lenses have been getting far better, especially when you look at devices like this, the Razer Kiyo Pro Ultra. The only real weakness with this device is the autofocus can be a little bit suspect and kind of slow, and sometimes it'll lose your face. Anyway, it's obvious to me the reason that Logitech did not reveal the sensor size or the focal length or the aperture of their lens is because they're really just not that proud of those specifications. I really can't tell you what those specs are, but I can give you some context clues. If there was a large sensor and a large aperture somewhere like the Razer Kiyo Pro Ultra, which I switch over to right here, then there's no way you'd have that much sharpness in the background. Also, for a webcam that costs this price, there is way too much grain. I only recommend the MX Brio for those that are specifically looking for a Logitech webcam and the best Logitech webcam that there is on the market. If you just want the best webcam period, I would look into the Razer Kiyo Pro Ultra. I think the automatic settings, which I have it on right now, the autofocus a little bit iffy, so you're gonna have to dial in things manually. And I feel like the frame rate is a little bit misleading. I feel like there are some frames that are just kind of missing. Not really sure how those are dropping off, even though the shutter speed is locked. But overall, when this is dialed in, this is still the best looking webcam on the market. I like what you're doing, Logitech, but I can't fully recommend this webcam unless you are a Logitech enthusiast.